My 6-year-old daughter, Chloe, and I were eating dinner at a family shelter when a black sedan rolled into the parking lot. An older woman stepped out, stared through the window, and went perfectly still, like she had seen a ghost. She came inside and asked, "Why are you not living in your house on Birchwood Lane?" I just blinked at her. "What house?" I did not yell, and I did not argue. I picked up my phone and made one call. 3 days later, I walked into my parents' anniversary party, and my mother's face drained of color. "My name is Madison Hart. I am 29. I teach 2nd grade, and I am raising my daughter on my own." This is the story of how my own parents kept a house hidden from me and cashed rent checks for 2 years, while Chloe and I slept on a shelter bunk. If you have ever been told to stay quiet for the sake of family, you will understand why I could not do that anymore. Let me take you back to last January, the week my apartment disappeared, and everything I believed about my family started to crack. The notice came on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were Chloe's library days, and she would burst through the door with her backpack crooked, grinning like she had won something. That day she carried home a picture book about a little cottage, and she kept pointing at the drawings, saying, "This one has a porch, Mommy." I set her books on the table, opened the envelope, and felt my stomach drop. My landlord was selling the building, and we had 30 days to be out. I read it twice, then a third time, hoping the words would change. They did not. Rent had jumped everywhere in town. My savings were thin, and every listing I called was already gone. After a week of rejections, I called my parents, thinking they would at least let us stay a few nights. My mother sighed like I'd asked for a favor, not a lifeline, and told me I needed to figure it out myself. I smiled anyway in front of Chloe, made macaroni, and told her we would be okay, even while my hands shook under the sink. The intake worker handed me a page of rules and a room number. The hallway smelled like industrial bleach, and someone else, spaghetti sauce. A fluorescent tube buzzed above our door, the kind of sound that crawls under skin. Chloe looked up at me and asked if this was a hotel. I told her it was temporary, because I needed to believe it. The beds were metal bunks with vinyl mattresses, and Chloe chose the top, calling it a treehouse. I lay on the lower bunk, staring at the slats, listening to her shift, and sigh, and shift again. She whispered that the light made a noise, and she meant the hum in the hall. I told her to close her eyes, and I made up a story about a girl who could talk to foxes. I do not remember the plot, but I remember the moment Chloe's breathing turned slow. Then I lay awake, hearing the buzzing light and a woman crying down the corridor. I kept thinking one sentence I could not say aloud. Chloe is going to remember this. The next morning, a woman with warm brown eyes knocked at 8:15. Her badge said Nina Peddle, case manager, and she spoke like someone who had done this before. She explained wait lists, emergency programs, and Section 8 timelines without pretending it would be quick. When I asked how long families usually stayed, she paused and said it varied. But she would help us leave fast. That night, I texted Patricia Hart a photo of Chloe's school art, a rainbow, over a house. Hours later, she replied, telling me to stop being dramatic and reminding me that hard times happen. I stared at the screen, then I saved it, and I started a folder on my phone called Records. I did not know why yet. I just knew I should. Our days became a routine of small humiliations. My alarm rang at 5:30, low enough not to wake neighbors. I showered in a communal bathroom with lukewarm water and no lock. I braided Chloe's hair with a comb I kept in my purse, because anything left behind vanished. I dropped her at before school care by 7:15, then drove to Maplewood Elementary, where I taught 2nd grade. By 4 o'clock, I picked her up, and by 5, we were back under that buzzing light. Every evening at the shelter, Chloe drew. There was a donated bin of crayons, most of them snapped in half, and most of them some tired shade of brown. Chloe used every single one anyway. She drew flowers, dogs, rainbows. But mostly she drew houses. Houses with big windows, and yards, and trees, and a path to the door. Sometimes she added smoke curling from a chimney, even though it was January, and our old place had no fireplace. I watched her fill page after page, and something cracked behind my ribs each time. One night, after she fell asleep on the top bunk, I sat on the bottom with a notepad, and I did the math again. First month, last month, and a security deposit meant $4,200 up front. I had $1,100 saved, which left a gap of $3,100 I did not have. I texted my brother, Logan Hart, and asked if he could help with the deposit. I promised I would pay him back within 6 months. He replied the next morning, saying he was tight, and that Mom said I should apply for Section 8. I set my phone down and opened social media because I wanted to understand what tight meant. Logan's newest post was a photo of a brand new silver sport utility vehicle with a caption about upgrading and being blessed. I did not answer him. I saved the screenshot to my records folder and I went to read Chloe her bedtime book. 3 weeks after we moved in, Patricia came to the shelter. She carried a plastic bag of hand-me-downs from Logan's kids, shirts with stained collars, jeans with frayed knees. She walked in smiling wide and told the front desk she was Chloe's grandmother. She signed the visitor log with looping cursive, then found us in the common room. Chloe was drawing, and Patricia swept in with open arms, acting warm for anyone watching. Chloe hugged her, and the staff smiled at the scene. When the staff stepped away, Patricia's smile thinned. She sat across from me, lowered her voice, and said she had been thinking. If this shelter situation kept going, she might need to talk to the court about Chloe's living arrangement. My blood went cold, because I knew what she was reaching for. Patricia was talking about the supplemental guardianship, the paperwork she had pushed during my divorce. The court had called it temporary, a formality while I stabilized housing. It gave her no custody, but it gave her standing, and she knew how to use it. She said she was not threatening me. She was only worried, as Chloe's legal guardian. I corrected her and said supplemental guardian, but she waved it off like it was the same thing. Then she kissed Chloe's forehead, spoke sweetly for the hallway, and walked out. I watched her sign the visitor log on the way, then I went back to our room and I started writing. Date, event, what was said, who heard it, and what it did to my pulse. I did not have a label for her behavior yet. I only knew it belonged on paper. A week later I found a studio on Stark Street, 600 square feet, 1 block from a bus line. The landlord said he would hold it for 72 hours, if I could put down $2,000. $2,000 was the space between Chloe drawing houses on shelter tables, and Chloe sleeping in a room I could lock. I called Patricia one more time, and told her I had found a place. I asked for a loan, and I offered to pay it back from my tax refund in March. She let out the long sigh she always used before a no, and said she and Dennis were on a fixed income. She said they simply did not have it. 2 weeks earlier she had posted a photo of Dennis grinning beside a truck, keys held up. Fixed income, I thought, and felt heat climb my throat. I did not argue, because I never argued. I let the apartment go, and the word temporary started to feel like a trap. That night, Chloe tugged my sleeve while I wrote, and asked when we were going home. I told her soon, even though soon had gone soft and shapeless. After she fell asleep, I opened my folder of documents. It was thick now, with notices, screenshots, logs, and my journal, all tabbed with sticky notes from my classroom. I slid it under the mattress, and I told myself we were out of options. 3 days later, the black sedan pulled into the shelter lot. The black sedan stopped by the curb, and the engine kept running softly. An older woman stepped out, straight-backed, dressed too well for this place. She walked past the front desk, and her eyes found Chloe first, then me. Her expression shifted, like grief and anger swapped positions in one breath. Nina Patel hovered near the doorway, ready to intervene, but the woman lifted one hand, calm and controlled. She introduced herself as Margaret Caldwell and said she was my grandmother. I had not seen her in years, not since my mother decided distance was a lesson. Margaret looked at the bunk bracelets on Chloe's wrist, and she looked back at me. She asked why I was not living in my house on Birchwood Lane, the house that was mine. I told her I did not own a house, and my voice sounded like someone else. Margaret blinked once, then her jaw tightened. She said she created a trust when I turned 18 because she wanted me safe. She said the deed was in my name, and the trust paperwork was filed properly. Then she said something that made my skin go cold. She had been shown photos of me cooking in that kitchen. I told her that was impossible, because I had never set foot there. Margaret pressed her fingers to her temple, and for a moment she looked older. She asked who had been sending her those photos, and I did not need to guess. She asked if Patricia and Dennis were helping me, and I told her they had not even offered a couch. Margaret took a slow breath. Then she turned to Chloe and smiled, softer. She asked if Chloe wanted a snack from her car, and Chloe nodded, because she was 6. Nina followed them, and I stayed at the table, staring at the crayons. When Margaret returned, she set a wrapped granola bar beside Chloe. Then she slid a business card toward me. The name was Ethan Brooks, real estate attorney. Margaret told me to call him right now, because someone was lying, and because time mattered. My hands shook as I dialed, and when the receptionist answered, I heard myself say I needed an urgent appointment. I did not cry. I did not scream. I only listened to my own heartbeat, and felt a door open inside me. Ethan Brooks met me in a small office 2 days later. Margaret Caldwell sat beside me, hands folded, watching everything. Ethan listened without interrupting. Then he opened his computer and asked for my full legal name. He pulled up the county property portal and showed me a deed with my name on it. The address was Birchwood Lane, and the owner line said Madison Hart, trustee. My throat tightened, because it felt unreal and obvious at once. Ethan explained that the trust was real, and the house was legally mine. He also explained that someone had been acting as me, without permission. He requested copies of the trust documents from Margaret, and he asked about the supplemental guardianship. When I told him Patricia Hart pushed it after my divorce, he nodded slowly, like he had seen this trick before. Then he searched public filings, and his mouth flattened. There was a recorded lease, renewed twice, listing the property as a rental. The rent amount was $1,800 per month, and the payments were directed to an account under Dennis Hart. I felt my face go numb, because Chloe and I were sleeping under fluorescent lights. Ethan printed the records and stacked them in front of me like bricks. He showed a second document, a home equity line of credit opened against the house. The limit was $60,000, and the draw history showed steady withdrawals. Margaret pressed one hand to her chest and whispered my mother's name, not as a question, but as a verdict. Ethan told us not to confront anyone yet, not until we had a clean paper trail. He said we needed bank statements, tenant information, and any emails or texts that proved control. He instructed me to request my credit reports and to place a fraud alert. He said we would notify the bank, and we would notify the property manager, and we would demand that all rent be redirected. Then he looked at me and asked where Chloe and I were living. When I said a family shelter, he said we would move fast because safety came first. I walked out with a folder of evidence, and my fear finally had shape. That night in the shelter, I could not eat. Chloe sat cross-legged on the bunk, drawing another house, a square with a heart on the door. She asked if we could have a yard someday, and I told her yes, because now it was true. After she fell asleep, I called Lauren Price, my cousin, because she was the one person my mother could not charm. Lauren listened, then asked me to repeat the rent amount and the loan limit, like she needed to hear it twice. She told me she would be my witness, and she told me to keep saving everything. The next morning, Margaret Caldwell drove me past Birchwood Lane. We did not stop at first. We only rolled by slowly, like we were casing a crime scene. The house was painted a clean gray, the porch light was on, and there were toys on the steps that did not belong to Chloe. A man opened the front door, and a child ran past him, laughing. My hands gripped the seatbelt, because that life was happening inside my walls. Ethan Brooks told us not to talk to the tenants yet, so we did not. We went back to his office instead, and he drafted letters, one to the bank, one to the property manager, and one to Patricia and Dennis Hart. He also called the court clerk and explained the process to terminate the supplemental guardianship. Hearing those words out loud made my stomach unclench, because it meant Patricia could not dangle my child over my head anymore. Nina Patel helped me fill out shelter paperwork for a rapid rehousing option, and she wrote a note confirming our residency dates. Every piece of paper felt like a stitch, closing a wound I had ignored. By the third day, Ethan had the final packet ready, and Margaret had arranged a family gathering we could not be kept out of. Patricia and Dennis were celebrating their anniversary at a rented hall, with cake, speeches, and all the relatives who believed their version of me. Ethan said we would not go to fight, we would go to document. Lauren agreed to stand beside me and to record everything. I looked at Chloe sleeping under a thin blanket, and I promised her quietly that no one would hide our home again. 3 days after Margaret Caldwell found us, I walked into the anniversary party like I belonged there. The hall was draped in white and gold, the kind of decorations my mother loved because they photographed well. Patricia Hart stood near the cake table, laughing too loudly, touching elbows, collecting compliments like tips. Dennis Hart moved through the room with a drink in his hand, playing the gentle host, the man everyone trusted. Logan Hart was there with Vanessa, smiling like nothing in our family had ever cracked. I kept my shoulders steady, and I kept Chloe close to my side, because she did not understand why my hands felt cold. Ethan Brooks had told me to stay calm, and to speak in facts, not feelings. Lauren Price stood behind me with her phone ready, and Margaret stood at my other shoulder, looking like a storm in pearls. Patricia saw us, and her smile froze in place. For 1 second, her eyes flicked down, like she checked if I had dirt on my shoes. Then she recovered and moved toward me. She bent toward Chloe, sugary and bright, then looked at me and asked why I was here. I told her we came to celebrate and to clear up a misunderstanding. Dennis stepped in, his voice low, warning me not to cause a scene. I nodded, and I waited. When the music dipped for speeches, Dennis tapped his glass and talked about family, about sacrifice, about how proud he was of his children. The room clapped, and I felt my jaw tighten. Margaret lifted her hand, and the applause thinned into confusion. She asked, politely, if everyone could spare a moment for the truth. Patricia tried to laugh it off, but her voice did not land. Margaret said she had recently learned that her granddaughter and great-granddaughter were living in a family shelter, while a house owned by Madison Hart was being rented out. A hush fell, and I heard someone whisper my name. Patricia opened her mouth, already building a story. Margaret did not let her. She gestured to me, and I placed a thin folder on the closest table, right beside the anniversary cake. I did not slam it. I did not throw it. I simply opened it and let the first page show my name on the deed. Patricia Hart tried to speak first, but Lauren Price stepped forward and said we were going in order. Her tone was calm, which made people listen. I pointed to the deed, then to the recorded lease, then to the payment direction under Dennis Hart. I explained slowly that the house on Birchwood Lane belonged to me through a trust created by Margaret Caldwell. I said I did not know it existed, because I had been kept away from the paperwork and kept away from Margaret. Someone near the punch bowl sucked in a sharp breath, and I recognized an aunt who had stopped calling me years ago. Dennis said I was confused, and that this was private family business. Margaret answered him, firm and clear, saying that fraud was not private. Patricia lifted her chin and claimed she was protecting me, that I was unstable after my divorce, that she had to manage things for my own good. I looked at her and said I was stable enough to work full-time, stable enough to raise Chloe, and stable enough to sleep in a shelter without taking from anyone. Then I held up my phone and described the messages she sent, the ones that called me dramatic, the ones that refused help, the ones that hinted she could involve the court. Lauren played a short clip, only the audio, so the room could hear Patricia's own voice. Patricia's face tightened, and she snapped that Lauren was twisting everything. Logan Hart finally spoke, eyes darting between us, asking what rent we were talking about. I said $1,800 a month for 2 years, while Chloe and I shared a bunk bed. Vanessa's mouth fell open, and she turned toward Patricia like she had never seen her before. Dennis stepped toward me, chest puffed, and told me to stop lying in front of everyone. Chloe squeezed my fingers, and I felt rage rise, but I kept my voice level. I told Dennis that the county records did not lie, and the bank records would not either. Patricia's eyes flicked to Margaret, calculating. Then she tried a softer angle, telling the room I was having a breakdown. Margaret did not move. She said, in a voice that carried, that Patricia had sent her staged photos and blocked my contact information while taking money from my property. The silence after that felt heavy, like the room itself decided who was believable. We left the party without shouting because the evidence did the shouting for us. In the parking lot, Chloe asked why Grandma Patricia looked angry. I told her adults sometimes get angry when they get caught. Margaret Caldwell drove us back to the shelter, and I watched streetlights smear across the window, thinking about how long I had been trained to doubt myself. The next morning, Ethan Brooks filed the termination request for the supplemental guardianship, and he sent formal notices to the bank and the property manager. He warned me that my parents would panic, and panic makes people reckless. Nina Patel helped me update my case file, and she wrote a letter confirming Chloe and I had been residents since January. Lauren Price organized my screenshots, my notes, and my call logs into a single timeline because timelines make liars stumble. By afternoon, my phone started vibrating with messages from Dennis Hart, then Patricia Hart, then Logan Hart. I did not answer calls. I saved everything. Patricia wrote that I had humiliated her, that Chloe would suffer because of my choices, that Margaret was manipulating me. Dennis wrote that I was ungrateful, and that I was destroying the family. Logan wrote a short line asking if there was any chance this was a misunderstanding. I replied only once, and I kept it simple. I said the deed is in my name, and the lease is on record, and Ethan Brooks is handling the rest. That evening, Ethan called and told me the bank froze access to the home equity line of credit while they investigated. He said the property manager agreed to redirect rent pending ownership verification, and that the tenants would be notified of the situation in a way that protected them. He also told me something that made my stomach twist. A locksmith invoice had been charged to an account tied to my parents, meaning they had changed locks more than once. I looked at Chloe sleeping, one arm flung over her blanket, and I realized my parents had been inside my house, in my name, while my child dreamed on a metal bunk. Then my phone rang again, and this time it was a voicemail from Patricia, her voice sharp and shaking, warning me that if I took her to court, she would make sure I lost everything. Patricia Hart voicemail played 3 times before I could breathe normally. Her voice was sharp, then it turned sweet, then it sharpened again. She warned me that court would ruin me, and she said Chloe would be taken from me if I did not stop. I saved the message, and I forwarded it to Ethan Brooks, because fear is smaller when it has a file name. Ethan called within an hour, and he told me to do 3 things. First, I would not answer calls, and I would not meet anyone alone. Second, I would request my credit reports and place a fraud alert, because my name had already been used like a costume. Third, I would keep Chloe's school informed, in writing, because people who lose control often try to grab it back through children. Nina Patel helped me draft a short letter for the front desk, and another letter for the school. It said only facts, and it included names, and it said no one was allowed to remove Chloe without my direct permission. I signed it with a pen that shook, and I hated that I needed it. The next day, my phone lit up with a message from Logan Hart, saying Patricia was devastated and asking if we could talk privately. I did not reply, because private talks were how my family rewrote reality. That afternoon, Maplewood Elementary called me during recess. The office secretary sounded careful, like she was choosing each word. She said Patricia Hart was in the lobby, and she insisted she had legal authority as guardian. I told the secretary to keep Chloe in her classroom and to call security. I drove there so fast my hands cramped on the steering wheel. When I arrived, Patricia stood near the counter, smiling at strangers, acting like the injured grandmother. When she saw me, her eyes tightened, and she started speaking fast, telling the staff I was unstable, telling them I was homeless, telling them she was only protecting Chloe. I did not argue with her. I handed the principal a copy of the court filing Ethan had prepared to terminate the supplemental guardianship. I also handed her the voicemail transcript and the shelter letter and my identification. The principal looked at Patricia and told her she needed to leave. Patricia's smile cracked, and she hissed that I was making a terrible mistake. Ethan filed an emergency motion that evening, and the next morning a judge signed an order that stripped away the last thread Patricia used to pull on my life. Ethan Brooks called on Friday, and his voice sounded like a door unlocking. He told me the property manager agreed to meet us at Birchwood Lane, and he had arranged for a locksmith to be present. The tenants had been notified, and they were frightened, but they were cooperating because they had paid rent in good faith. Margaret Caldwell rode with me, and Chloe sat in the back seat humming softly, unaware of how close we were to the truth. When we turned onto Birchwood Lane, my stomach rolled. The house looked even more real in daylight, like a place that should have held our mornings. The property manager met us on the porch, and the tenants stood behind him, tense and apologetic. Ethan explained, carefully, that they were not at fault, and that their lease would be honored while the legal process settled, or they would be helped to relocate. I watched their faces ease a little, and I realized they were victims too, just in a different way. The locksmith changed the lock and handed me a set of keys that felt too heavy for something so small. Then he opened the door, and I stepped inside my own house for the first time. It smelled like someone else's detergent and someone else's dinner. There were scuff marks on the wall near the entry, and a coat rack that was not mine, and a family photo of strangers on the mantel. My throat tightened, but I stayed quiet, because this was not the moment for emotion. This was the moment for control. Ethan walked through each room, taking photos, noting condition, and speaking in calm legal phrases. Margaret stood in the kitchen, one hand on the counter, like she needed the contact to stay steady. I looked at Chloe, and I saw her eyes widen at the staircase, at the window light, at the space. She whispered that it was big, and she asked if it was ours. I knelt, and I told her yes, it is ours, and we are going to be safe here. She wrapped her arms around my neck, and for a second I forgot every fluorescent light in the shelter. Nina Patel later helped me coordinate the move, even though our housing plan changed overnight. She smiled when she said the words, "You are going home," and she meant it like a blessing. The week after we entered the house, Patricia and Dennis Hart stopped pretending. Ethan Brooks received emails filled with rage, then sudden apologies, then threats again. Dennis accused Margaret Caldwell of poisoning me, and Patricia insisted she only managed the trust because I was not responsible. Ethan answered once, and only once, with a demand for restitution. He listed the rent, the loan withdrawals, the locksmith charges, and the legal fees. He also attached the county records, because evidence is louder than family. Margaret told me she would not negotiate in my parents' kitchen, or behind closed doors, or with tears as currency. So we met at Ethan's office, under bright lights, with paper and witnesses. Patricia arrived dressed like a church lady, face carefully composed. Dennis arrived stiff, jaw tight, eyes scanning for allies. Logan Hart came too, and he looked smaller than he had at the party, like he finally understood the ground was moving. Patricia tried to speak to Chloe in the lobby, but I stepped between them, and I kept my voice even. I told her she could not address my child, not without my permission, not ever again. Inside the conference room, Ethan laid out the terms. The home equity line of credit would be closed. The withdrawn funds would be repaid through a structured plan, enforced by court order if necessary. All rent collected would be returned to me and to Margaret, as the trust required. Patricia's face tightened, and she said this was cruel. Margaret answered that cruelty was cashing rent checks while a child slept on a bunk. Dennis muttered about family loyalty, and I told him loyalty does not include fraud. Logan said he did not know, and I believed he did not know everything, but I also knew he benefited from silence. In the end, Patricia signed because Ethan made the alternative clear. Criminal referral was on the table, and Margaret was willing. When we left, the air felt different, cleaner, like a room after a storm. That night, Chloe walked through the empty bedroom that would be hers, and she taped a drawing to the wall. It was a house with a porch, and a heart on the door, and she wrote our names in careful letters. I stood in the doorway, holding a box of donated towels, and I realized the quiet I was hearing was not loneliness. It was the sound of boundaries finally holding. 2 days after the meeting at Ethan Brooks' office, Patricia Hart tried again. She sent an email to my work account, pretending it was about Chloe. She wrote that she missed her, and that she deserved a visit. Then the tone flipped, and she warned me about family reputation. I forwarded it to Ethan, and I did not reply. That afternoon, Dennis Hart showed up at Maplewood Elementary and told the front desk he needed to speak with me. The secretary called my classroom, and my stomach tightened, but I kept my voice steady. I asked her to tell him I was unavailable, and to document the attempt. When I got home, Margaret Caldwell was already at my kitchen table. She had a notebook open, and she was writing dates like a historian. Lauren Price arrived 5 minutes later, and she brought printed screenshots because paper feels final. Ethan called us on speaker, and he said we were past warnings. He explained the next step, a no-contact order, tied to the threats and the school incident. He said we would not rely on hope, we would rely on court enforcement. The paperwork moved faster than I expected, because the voicemail, the emails, and the school report lined up cleanly. A judge granted a temporary order, then scheduled a hearing. Patricia tried to argue that she was a concerned grandmother, and that I was unstable, but she could not erase the shelter letter, or the bank investigation, or the recorded lease. The order became permanent, with clear distance rules and clear consequences. When Ethan told me it was signed, I felt relief, then grief, then relief again. That night, Chloe asked why we did not visit Grandma Patricia anymore. I told her some people love in ways that hurt, and I will not let anyone hurt us. She nodded like she understood more than she should. Then she asked if she could paint her room, and her voice sounded lighter. I said yes, and we picked a color together. One that looked like morning. The house looked normal from the street, but it carried other people's fingerprints. Ethan Brooks advised me to document everything before I changed a single thing. So I walked room to room with my phone, recording slow, steady footage. Scuffed baseboards, a cracked tile, a closet door that did not close. In the garage I found boxes of mail, some addressed to me, some forwarded, some opened. Margaret Caldwell watched my face, and I could tell she was blaming herself. I told her the blame belonged where the fraud lived, not where love tried to protect. Nina Patel came by the next day, because she wanted to close our shelter case properly. She hugged Chloe, then hugged me, and she left a small grocery gift card on the counter. She said she had seen families crawl out of worse, and she believed we would stay out. Ethan handled the bank, and the property manager, and the repayment schedule. The rent checks were redirected, and the home equity line of credit was closed for good. The tenants moved out within a month, and I helped them find a new place, because they deserved dignity too. Lauren Price helped me set up a binder for the legal trail, and a second binder for my life. School forms, medical records, and a calendar with real plans. I replaced the locks, then replaced them again, because I needed the sound of a key that only I owned. I froze my credit, and I set alerts on every account. Logan Hart sent one last message, asking if we could talk. I told him he could email Ethan, because I was done negotiating with silence. Vanessa Hart mailed a short note to Margaret, apologizing for not seeing it sooner. I did not hate her, but I did not invite her in either. Slowly, the house started to shift from evidence to home. Chloe taped her drawings on the fridge, and for the first time, none of them felt like a wish. The first Saturday morning in the house, I woke up before Chloe, out of habit. The shelter had trained my body to expect noise and light and interruption. Instead, I heard quiet, and I heard a neighbor watering plants outside. I walked into the kitchen, and I made pancakes from a mix Nina Patel gave me, back when she thought we would be rehoused slowly. The smell filled the room, and it felt like a small victory. Chloe came down the stairs in socks, rubbing her eyes, and she stopped halfway. She looked around like she was checking if the scene was real. Then she ran to the table, climbed into a chair, and asked if this was our morning now. I told her yes, and my voice did not shake. Margaret Caldwell arrived with a box of new towels and a second-hand lamp, and she stood in the doorway, watching Chloe eat. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry, not yet. Lauren Price came later, carrying paint samples, because she wanted Chloe to choose her room color like it mattered. We spent the day sanding a wall, wiping down cabinets, and opening windows. The air moved through the rooms like it was learning us. At one point, Chloe asked if Patricia Hart would come here again. I told her the court said no, and I said I will keep that promise. She went quiet. Then she asked if she could plant something in the yard. So we bought a small pot, and we planted seeds, and we watered them carefully. That night I tucked her into her own bed, and she asked me to leave the door cracked, just a little. I did, and I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to her breathing. In the shelter, I used to count the minutes until morning. In this house, I let the minutes pass without counting, because safety finally had walls. The first week in the house, I expected peace to arrive fully formed, but it came in pieces. Every afternoon I checked the mailbox, and every day brought something new. A letter from the bank, confirming the investigation was active. A court notice, listing the guardianship hearing date. A thin envelope from Patricia Hart lawyer, asking for mediation. Ethan Brooks told me to let him answer, and to keep my hands off the fire. Still, my body reacted like it used to. Tense shoulders, shallow breath, eyes scanning for danger. At school I smiled for my students, and taught subtraction with bright marker ink. Then I came home, and found Chloe in her room, lining crayons on her new desk. She asked if Grandma Patricia would come to the door, and I told her the order meant she could not. Chloe nodded, then asked if an order could break, like a toy. I told her adults can break rules, but judges can enforce consequences. That night, Logan Hart sent a long message, saying he did not know, saying Patricia was sick with worry. He asked me to stop, for the sake of family, and for the sake of Chloe. I saved it, and I did not respond. Lauren Price called, furious on my behalf, and reminded me that family did not pay our rent. Margaret Caldwell visited the next morning, carrying breakfast sandwiches and a small stack of old photos. Me as a teenager, smiling beside her at a lake, before my mother built distance. Margaret said Patricia cut me off from her, then lied about why. Hearing that made my grief sharper, but it also made it clean. I told Margaret I was not asking for revenge. I was asking for reality. She squeezed my hand and said reality is the only place healing starts. The hearing happened on a Monday morning, under bright courthouse lights. I wore a plain navy dress and held my folder like a shield. Ethan Brooks sat beside me, calm and steady, and Margaret Caldwell sat behind us. Patricia Hart arrived with Dennis Hart, and they did not look at Chloe. Their lawyer spoke first, asking the judge for compassion, claiming Patricia only tried to help. Ethan stood and spoke in clean facts, not feelings, not guesses. He described the shelter letter, and the voicemail threat, and the school incident. He laid out the recorded lease, the rent payments, and the loan withdrawals, with dates attached. The judge asked Patricia why Madison Hart never received a key, or a letter, or a call. Patricia tried to answer, but her story tangled, and her eyes kept flicking toward Dennis. The judge ended the supplemental guardianship completely and extended the no-contact order. I felt my chest loosen, like a knot finally cut. Outside the courtroom, Dennis stepped close and hissed that I ruined them. Ethan moved between us and told him to back away because everything was being documented. That afternoon, Ethan spoke with the investigator tied to the bank report and delivered the same packet. He told me the investigation might take months and reminded me my priority was Chloe. The restitution agreement moved faster because Patricia wanted the problem quiet. The terms were signed, the repayment schedule was filed, and the home equity line of credit stayed closed. When I drove home, Chloe asked if it was over. I told her it was safer now, and we would keep it that way. She looked at the trees on our street and said she liked the shade. 2 weeks later, Chloe brought home a school assignment called My Safe Place. She sat at the kitchen table, tongue pressed to her lip, and drew our house again. This time, she added a mailbox, a bedroom window, and a little garden out front. Under the picture she wrote, in careful first-grade letters, "Home is where my mom is." I read it once, then I read it again, because I needed to. That night, I asked my therapist why my hands still shook, even when the doors were locked. She said my nervous system lived on alert, and it needed time to learn new rules. So I built small rituals, the kind the shelter never allowed. I brewed tea after Chloe went to bed and sat by the window for 10 minutes. I wrote 1 page in my journal. Not evidence, just truth. I checked the locks once, not 5 times, and I let that be enough. Margaret Caldwell called every Sunday, and she never pressured me. She only listened. Nina Paddle visited once and brought a card signed by shelter staff. It said they were proud of us, and it made me cry in the quiet. Lauren Price helped me donate clothes we no longer needed because I wanted to turn fear into help. When Logan Hart emailed again, he asked for a supervised visit, saying Patricia missed Chloe. I replied with 1 sentence, that the court order was clear, and it would be respected. Then I closed my laptop and went outside with Chloe. We planted seeds in the yard, and Chloe watered them with a bright blue cup. She asked what seeds need to grow, and I told her sunlight, water, and patience. She nodded like she understood something bigger, then said she wanted our flowers to be strong. I looked at her and thought, me too. A week after the hearing, a box appeared on my porch, with no return address, and my stomach tightened. Inside were children books, a stuffed rabbit, and a card signed "Grandma loves you." There were no threats on paper, but the message was still a reach, a hand sliding past the court order. Chloe saw the rabbit and smiled, because she did not know the rules adults break. I took a photo, then I sealed the box again, and I called Ethan Brooks. He told me not to touch the card again, and not to deliver it myself. He arranged for it to be logged and returned through proper channels, with a written warning attached. Later that day, Logan Hart texted that he was only trying to help, and that Patricia Hart was heartbroken. I did not argue, and I did not explain. I wrote 1 line back, that the court order is the court order, and it will be respected. Then I saved the message, and I turned my phone face down. That night, Chloe asked why we could not keep the rabbit. I told her we can keep safe things, but we cannot keep things that come from broken rules. She frowned, then nodded, and asked if we could buy our own rabbit someday. I told her yes, when we are ready, and we will choose it together. The next morning I drove to work, and I noticed my shoulders were not as high. In my classroom, I read aloud to my students, and my voice felt steady again. After school, Nina Paddle stopped by, because she was checking on us, and because she cared like it was personal. She asked if I was sleeping, and I told her I was learning. I still woke up sometimes, hearing fluorescent buzzing in my head, but then I heard quiet, and I remembered where I was. When Chloe and I got home, we went straight to the yard. Our seeds had pushed up through the soil, small green loops, stubborn and bright. Chloe clapped. Then she ran inside for water, careful not to spill. I watched her crouch by the garden, and I thought about how healing looks. It looks like a child trusting the ground again. The first restitution payment arrived on a Monday as a direct transfer with a bland memo line. I stared at the number, then I forced myself to breathe. Money can return to an account, but it cannot return to January nights, and it cannot return to Chloe asking if shelter is a hotel. Ethan Brooks reminded me that restitution is a tool, not forgiveness, and I agreed. Margaret Caldwell asked if I wanted to push for criminal charges, because she was still furious, and because she could not accept what was done. I told her I would follow Ethan's advice, and I would prioritize stability first. Ethan said the bank investigation was still open, and a referral could still happen, even without my choice. He also said that repayment compliance would matter, and so would any new violations. That week, Patricia Hart tried to send another message, this time through an aunt I barely knew. The aunt called me, voice trembling, and asked why I was doing this to my mother. I did not raise my voice. I told her Chloe and I lived in a family shelter, while my house was rented and a loan was taken in my name. The aunt went quiet, then she said she did not know, and she ended the call quickly. Lauren Price later told me that silence is the oldest family currency, and people panic when it loses value. Logan Hart emailed Ethan, asking for a way to fix it. Ethan replied with one line: follow the court order, and follow the payment schedule, and stop all indirect contact. At home, Chloe asked if we were poor anymore. I told her we are safe, and we are careful, and we are building. She accepted that like a grown-up, then asked if we could make cookies. We did, and flour dusted the counter, and the kitchen finally felt like ours. That night, I wrote in my journal, not evidence, not timelines, just one sentence. I am allowed to protect my child, even from my own parents. I slept after that, deeper than I had in months. 6 months after we left the shelter, Chloe started second grade with a new backpack and a new routine. She walked into Maplewood Elementary like she belonged there, because she did. I watched her disappear into the hallway, then I sat in my car and let my hands rest on the steering wheel, not gripping, just resting. The repayment schedule continued on time, and Ethan Brooks said that consistency mattered, even if it felt hollow. The no-contact order stayed in place, and Patricia Hart finally stopped testing it. Dennis Hart sent one message through his lawyer, asking for reconsideration, and Ethan answered no, don't it. Margaret Caldwell stopped blaming herself out loud, and she started showing up in practical ways. She came for Sunday dinners, she brought fruit, and she listened without rewriting history. Lauren Price remained my witness, but she also became my friend again, not just my shield. Nina Paddle called once a month, and every time she said she was proud, I felt something soften. Chloe's seeds became flowers, bright and stubborn, and she named them after colors, not after people. One evening, Chloe brought home a drawing and taped it to the refrigerator. It was our house, a porch, a mailbox, and a garden. She drew me in the doorway, and she drew herself in the yard. There was no shadow figure, and no bunk bed, and no buzzing light. Under the picture she wrote, in careful letters, "My home is safe." I stood there longer than I meant to, and I realized the biggest change was not the house itself. The biggest change was that I no longer begged for permission to be protected. I stopped chasing apologies that were never coming, and I stopped explaining myself to people committed to misunderstanding. Chloe fell asleep that night with her bedroom door cracked, just a little, and I left it that way. Then I walked through the quiet rooms, turned off the lights, and locked the front door once. One lock, one key, one home, and a future that finally belonged to us. By October, the house smelled like cinnamon more often, and Chloe started bringing home paper pumpkins from school. I thought the hardest part was behind us, until an envelope arrived with a familiar handwriting. It was addressed to Chloe, not to me, like a shortcut around my boundary. Inside was a holiday invitation from Logan Hart and Vanessa Hart, a Thanksgiving dinner at their place, with a note that said they wanted family together again. Beneath that, there was a second note, written by Patricia Hart, tucked in like a secret. She wrote that she missed Chloe, that she had prayed, and that it was time to stop punishing everyone. She did not say sorry, not once. She did not mention the shelter, the rent, or the loan. She only asked for access, dressed up as peace. Chloe saw the words Grandma on Thanksgiving, and her face brightened for a moment. Then she looked at me, searching my eyes like she was reading weather. I told her we could have our own Thanksgiving at home, and we would invite people who respect our safety. She asked if that meant Margaret Caldwell, and Lauren Price, and Nina Patel, and I said yes. That night I emailed Ethan Brooks and asked what the order allowed, because I wanted my answer to be clean and final. He replied that any contact through third parties was a violation, and he advised me to document and ignore. I photographed the notes, filed them in my binder, and put the envelope away. Logan called 2 days later, voice careful, saying he wanted to fix this, and that Patricia was only trying to make amends. I told him amends start with truth, not with hidden notes to a child. He said I was making it hard for everyone, and I said it was already hard when Chloe and I slept under fluorescent lights. I did not raise my voice, and I did not debate. I told him the court order stands, and Thanksgiving would not be a loophole. After the call, I felt shaky, then steady, because I recognized the pattern. They always called my boundary drama, because drama was how they controlled the story. Chloe and I spent that weekend making a paper chain for our living room, and she asked if we were still a family. I told her yes, we are a family, and our job is to keep each other safe. A few weeks later, Logan Hart asked to meet me for coffee. Alone, no lawyers, no witnesses. I told him no, because alone meetings were where my childhood memories got rewritten. I offered a different option, a public place, Margaret Caldwell present, and the conversation documented. Logan agreed, and we met at a busy cafe on a Saturday morning. Chloe stayed home with Margaret, because she did not need adult tension in her day. Lauren Price sat at a nearby table, not hidden, just present, because presence changes behavior. Logan arrived looking tired, like the last year finally reached him. He started with the same line, that he did not know the house was mine, and he did not know Patricia and Dennis were collecting rent. I believed he did not know everything, but I also knew he enjoyed the benefits of not asking. I asked him a simple question: when did he learn Chloe and I were in a shelter? He hesitated, then admitted he knew within the first month, because Patricia told him it was temporary, and I was being dramatic. That word again, dramatic, like a stamp that cancels empathy. I told him I asked for help, and he told me to apply for housing assistance, while he posted photos of upgrades. Logan looked down and said Patricia told him I had support, and that Margaret had set things up. Margaret leaned forward and said Patricia kept Madison away from Margaret on purpose, and Logan finally looked startled, like he could not pretend it was a misunderstanding anymore. I told Logan I did not need him to pick sides. I needed him to stop carrying messages, and to stop helping Patricia break the order. He asked if there was any path back for Patricia, and I said there is a path, but it starts with accountability, and it does not start with Chloe. If Patricia wants to change, she can do it through Ethan Brooks, through court-compliant channels, and with professional help, not with guilt and gifts. Logan nodded, and for the first time, he looked like someone hearing consequences, not complaints. Before we left, he asked if I hated him. I told him I do not hate him, but I do not trust silence anymore. Then I walked out, breathing easier, because the conversation ended on my terms. In December, Chloe and I hosted our own holiday meal in our own kitchen. Nina Patel came first, carrying a pie and a smile that looked like relief. Lauren Price arrived with paint-stained hands, because she had been helping me finish the last corner of Chloe's room. Margaret Caldwell showed up with a small tree, and she let Chloe place the first ornament, a paper house with a heart on the door. We ate, we laughed, and no one asked me to shrink myself to make the room comfortable. After dinner, Margaret asked me to sit with her in the living room, and she brought out a folder, not evidence, not court papers, but trust documents updated and clean. She said she wanted everything transparent now, so no one could hide assets behind love again. Ethan Brooks had reviewed it, the deed language was clarified, and the trust terms were spelled out in plain English. Margaret also asked if I would name a guardian for Chloe, in case anything ever happened to me. My throat tightened, because that question used to feel like fear, but now it felt like responsibility. I chose Lauren, and Lauren cried quietly, then nodded and said she would protect Chloe with her whole life. In the weeks that followed, the restitution payments continued, steady and cold, like a clock. The bank investigation stayed open, and Ethan told me to keep documenting, but to keep living. So I did. I learned which neighbor had the friendly dog, and which street had the best fall leaves. Chloe learned how to ride a bike in our driveway, and she fell once, then got up and tried again. One evening she asked if I still felt scared sometimes, and I told her yes, but it is different now. I told her fear used to run our days, and now it only visits. She asked what made it leave, and I said boundaries, truth, and people who show up. Chloe leaned into my side and said she liked our people. I looked around our quiet living room, and I realized she was right. This house was not just a property anymore. It was a place where safety could finally settle and stay. In early January, I stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop, and I started building a calendar that assumed safety. Chloe went back to school with a new lunchbox and a quiet confidence I had not seen before. I returned to my classroom, and my students kept me honest, because children do not care about family politics. They care about who shows up. One afternoon, Ethan Brooks called and told me the bank investigation was moving forward, and they wanted one more signed statement from me. I met him in his office, and I wrote my story in plain language, dates, amounts, and the shelter address. I did not add extra emotion because facts were enough. Margaret Caldwell sat beside me again, steady as a wall, and she apologized for the 100th time. I finally told her to stop apologizing for trying to protect me, and to focus on protecting Chloe with me. That same week, Logan Hart emailed, saying Patricia Hart wanted to send an apology letter through the lawyer, and not through third parties. Ethan said that was allowed, if it stayed within court-compliant channels, and if it did not pressure me to respond. I agreed to receive it, not because I missed them, but because I wanted to see if truth could exist on paper. The letter arrived 2 days later. Patricia wrote that she regretted how things unfolded, and she missed Chloe, and she felt misunderstood. She did not say fraud. She did not say shelter. And she did not say I am sorry. It was grief without accountability, and it landed like a hollow bell. I filed it, and I did not answer. That night, Chloe asked why I looked sad. I told her I can feel sad and still do the right thing. She nodded, then asked if we could make hot chocolate, and I said yes. We stood at the stove, stirring slowly, and Chloe told me she liked our home better than any hotel. I laughed. Then I felt tears rise, because the word hotel still hurt. I wiped my face, and I reminded myself that healing is not a straight line. It is a series of small choices. I chose sleep over scrolling, and quiet over arguments, and truth over pretending. The next morning, I locked the door once, and drove Chloe to school. And for the first time in a long time, my chest felt light. In February, Chloe and I were in the grocery store after school, picking apples and cereal, when I saw Dennis Hart at the end of an aisle. For a second, my body reacted before my mind. Shoulders tight, breath shallow, eyes scanning for Patricia Hart. Dennis saw me too, and he started walking fast, like urgency could erase a court order. I took Chloe's hand and I moved toward the customer service desk, because public places still have corners. Dennis stopped 3 steps away, and his face looked older than I remembered. He said he only wanted to talk, and that everything had gone too far. I told him the no-contact order was clear, and he needed to step back. He shook his head and said he was her father, like biology was permission. Chloe pressed against my side, quiet and still, listening. I asked Dennis if he remembered the shelter bunk beds, and he looked away. He said Patricia was suffering, and he said the family was embarrassed, and he said I should think about forgiveness. I told him forgiveness is not the same as access, and safety is not negotiable. A store employee approached and asked if we were okay. I said yes, but I need space, and the employee stayed nearby, watching Dennis. Dennis lowered his voice and said I could lose everything if I kept pushing the bank investigation. I told him I did not push it. I reported facts, and the bank chose what to do next. He took one step closer, and I took one step back, keeping Chloe behind me. I told him I would call the police if he did not leave. Dennis stared at me, then at Chloe, and his expression flickered, like he wanted to blame me for her fear. He finally stepped away, muttering that I was tearing the family apart. I watched him walk out, and my hands shook, but I stayed upright. When we got to the car, Chloe asked if Dennis was mad at us. I told her he was mad at consequences, and consequences are what keep people safe. That night, I emailed Ethan Brooks, with the time, the place, and what was said. Ethan replied that Dennis violated the order, and he would file a notice. I did not feel triumphant. I felt clear. The next day, Chloe brought home a drawing of our family, just her and me and Margaret Caldwell, and it looked simple, and it looked peaceful, and it looked true. After the grocery store incident, I realized something that surprised me. I was no longer afraid of being called dramatic. That word had controlled me for years, because it made me doubt my own reality. Now I knew the pattern. They used drama to avoid accountability, and they used shame to keep me quiet. Ethan Brooks filed the violation notice, and the court sent a formal warning to Dennis Hart, with clear consequences for any repeat contact. Margaret Caldwell told me she was proud, and I believed her. Lauren Price reminded me that boundaries are not walls. They are doors with locks, and I choose who gets a key. Nina Patel called, checking in, and she told me she sees this cycle all the time, a family system that survives by silencing one person. She said the person who breaks the silence gets blamed, because the truth changes everything. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, and I wrote out the story again, not for court, not for evidence, but for myself. I wrote about the day the eviction notice arrived, and the night Chloe asked if shelter is a hotel. I wrote about Margaret Caldwell walking into that shelter, and about the deed with my name on it. I wrote about the rent checks, and the loan, and the moment I set a folder on a cake table. I realized the biggest transformation was not the house. It was my voice. Chloe came downstairs in pajamas and asked what I was doing. I told her I was writing our story, so I never forget what we survived. She climbed into my lap and said she remembers the bunk bed, but she likes remembering the garden more. I told her we can remember both, because remembering pain does not erase joy. The next morning we checked the flower sprouts, and Chloe said they were getting taller, and I said so are we. Later that week, Ethan Brooks called with an update. The bank investigator wanted one final interview, and then they would decide next steps. I thanked him, and I looked at Chloe drawing at the table, calm and focused. I knew whatever came next, I was ready to keep choosing safety, and I would not ask permission to do it. The final interview happened on a Tuesday morning, under plain office lighting and a clock that ticked too loud. The bank investigator introduced herself and asked me to confirm my name, my address, and my relationship to the house on Birchwood Lane. I answered slowly, and I kept my hands flat on the table. She asked when I first learned the property existed, and I told her the truth. It was the day Margaret Caldwell found us at the shelter. She asked if I ever signed a lease or authorized rent collection, and I said no. She asked if I ever approved a home equity line of credit, and I said no. Then she asked how I survived those months, and I felt my throat tighten, because survival is not a number on a form. I told her I worked full-time, I taught second grade, and I put my child to bed on a metal bunk. I told her my parents refused help, and later threatened custody. The investigator nodded, wrote notes, and asked for copies of the voicemail, the school report, and the shelter letter. I gave her the same clean packet Ethan Brooks prepared, because clean packets do not give liars room. When she finished, she told me the bank would complete its review soon, and she said the case could be referred to law enforcement. She did not promise an outcome, she only promised a process. I walked out feeling both lighter and tired, like I had carried a box down too many stairs. That evening, Chloe asked why I looked serious, and I told her I had to tell the truth again, to keep us safe. She nodded, then asked if we could bake banana bread, because our kitchen smells like home when we bake. While the batter stirred, I realized something simple and huge. I was no longer afraid of paperwork. I was afraid of silence, and I had already ended that. A week later, Logan Hart sent an email to Ethan Brooks and asked for permission to speak with me. Ethan forwarded it and reminded me that I did not owe anyone access. I read Logan's message twice, because it did not sound like the old script. He wrote that he was sorry, not for the stress, but for the shelter, and for the way he repeated Patricia Hart words without checking facts. He admitted he enjoyed the comfort of believing the easiest story, because it kept him safe. He said Vanessa Hart was furious and embarrassed and also heartbroken, because she realized how close Chloe had been to danger. Logan asked if he could rebuild a relationship with me, without involving Patricia or Dennis Hart. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, listening to the quiet house and to Chloe humming upstairs. Then I wrote back one careful paragraph. I said I am open to rebuilding slowly, but only with clear rules. No messages from Patricia, no gifts, no invitations that try to corner me, and no conversations that rewrite the past. I said any contact must respect the court order, and the repayment plan, and my role as Chloe mother. Logan replied the next day, agreeing, and he thanked me for being direct. It did not fix the past, but it felt like the first honest brick. Margaret Caldwell told me truth is how families become real again, if they ever do. Lauren Price told me I handled it like a grown woman, not like the child they trained. That night, I tucked Chloe into bed, and she asked if people can change. I told her some people can, if they want truth more than control. She considered that, then said she wants to be the kind of person who changes for the better. I kissed her forehead and told her she already is. 1 year after the shelter, Chloe and I celebrated her birthday in our backyard. Nina Patel came with a small cake, and she brought a card signed by people who once kept us afloat. Margaret Caldwell hung paper lanterns and laughed when the wind grabbed one. Lauren Price showed up with sidewalk chalk, and Chloe covered the driveway with bright shapes, houses, flowers, and a sun that took up half the concrete. Logan Hart came for an hour, alone, and he stayed polite and careful, and he did not mention Patricia Hart. He asked Chloe about school, and he listened like listening matters. When he left, he thanked me for letting him earn trust, instead of demanding it. Later that evening, Ethan Brooks called with the update I expected. The bank completed its review, and the file was moving forward through the proper channels. He did not ask me to feel any way about it. He only confirmed that accountability does not require my permission. After the call, I stood at the kitchen sink, watching Chloe chase bubbles in the yard, and I let myself feel everything at once. Anger for what was stolen, grief for what should have been, and relief for what we built anyway. Chloe ran inside, cheeks flushed, and asked if she could hang her newest drawing on the refrigerator. It was our house again, but this time she drew a tall fence, a garden, and 2 figures holding hands. She wrote, in careful letters, safe and love. I told her it was perfect, and I meant it. That night, after she fell asleep, I walked through the rooms and turned off lights, one by one. I locked the front door once, and I did not check it again. I went to bed knowing the difference between peace and pretending, and I chose peace.